Hello and welcome to episode 23 of Reflecting the Way Radio, Meeting God in the Wilderness. I'm your host, Evan. We'll jump right in. If you haven't already done so, please head on over to reflectingtheway.com or scroll to the description box below and find the link to both the homepage and the accompanying blog post that is kind of a companion article to this episode. I would also encourage you, if you haven't already done so, check us out on Facebook and Twitter. Links are in the description box below. And for those of you who didn't catch the original broadcast of this episode last week, we did suffer some technical difficulties last week, so this is in fact a rebroadcast of our show from last week. And when I say rebroadcast, I don't mean I'm posting a saved audio file. I mean I physically have to sit here and tell you the whole story again. So it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. So moving right along here, meeting God in the wilderness. Now, there's kind of two ways to look at this, and I'm going to focus on one today. The other I'm sure we'll touch on in the future, but for now we'll leave it alone. And let's start from I think the best place to start is the beginning, so let's start at the beginning. Many of you listening will be aware that you're hard-pressed to find a religious system or spiritual belief that doesn't, at some point in its history or in some way in its theology, point towards escaping civilization in some capacity to go out into the wild lands to meet with God or become more spiritual or whatever. And that's all fine and dandy, but what many people don't realize or haven't thought about, perhaps a better way to put it, is the fact that Christianity has pretty much the same tradition. Now, that has largely fallen by the wayside, especially in the last couple of centuries with evangelical Christianity. But if you look back, we can go all the way back through history. And like I said, with the exception of the last couple of hundred years with Protestants, there have always been kind of ascetic, monastic, orders of monks and nuns and what have you, Catholic, Orthodox, and otherwise, surprisingly enough for some folks, that there's always been this undercurrent within Christianity where there is this sect of people, like I said, within the Catholic Church and outside the Catholic Church, that have pursued a relationship with God by removing themselves from society. Now, obviously, we can have a discussion about whether that's the best method for spreading the gospel or not, but the fact remains this is a tradition in Christianity proper. Now, if that isn't enough for you, if you're a little bit Catholic phobic, and I'm by no means an advocate for Catholicism, but if the only thing you can think of when I say that is Catholic monks, well, let me point you towards Jesus himself, where before the cross and, the Mount of Transfiguration, he went off basically more or less by himself onto the Mount of Transfiguration, into the Garden of Gethsemane. And actually, he was even tested in the wilderness 40 days and 40 nights by the adversary himself, if you'll recall. And in most of those cases, he was alone or nearly alone, seeking the Father, or some would say facing his demons. I don't necessarily like that verbiage, but regardless, you get the message. He removed himself from the city, and he removed himself from the distraction of people around him in order to seek something spiritual. Now, as ever, this has to be kept in balance. Understand that there are extremes here. But just because there are extremes doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just like there are extremes in the expression of spiritual gifts, which are patently and biblically wrong. Just read 1 Corinthians. That doesn't mean that the spiritual gifts themselves are innately wrong, obviously. And so you have this example with Jesus. And if you go through the first, second, third, and even fourth century, there's always this subset of Christianity. They've gone by different names. Probably the most famous and probably the most controversial of the groups would be the Desert Fathers. They started, I believe, in Egypt, and they would go off into the desert by themselves with the sole goal to become more Christ-like. And they were truly seeking the Father. Now, remember, like I said, there's always extremes, but we're not talking about extremes here. I'm just saying that to show you that while, some may conflate finding God in the wilderness with, an Aborigine spirit walk or, a Buddhist temple in Tibet or whatever, there is precedent for it in Christianity, and there's a strong precedent for it in Christianity. So take that for what you will, and now we're going to move along. There are two basic ways to meet God in the wilderness, and they function very differently. And actually, you see them to some degree with Jesus as well, where in one case he's in Gethsemane praying, and he's alone, he's in what I presume to be a tranquil location, and he's seeking a specific answer. He has a specific prayer. He has a specific issue on his mind, right? And this is the whole kind of, cliche line of the old song, going down to the river to pray, right? And that's one aspect of finding God in the wilderness when I use that kind of verbiage. The other way to do this and to look at this is very similar in function to fasting, where fasting is used to diminish physical, to weaken the flesh in such a way that the spirit is strengthened, or so that you can remove the distraction of food or what have you to better hear the voice of God. And the second way that I'm referencing meeting God in the wilderness functions very much this way. In fact, when Jesus went to be tested in the desert for 40 days, he did it in conjunction with fasting, interestingly enough. And that's the type I want to touch on here. And the reason I want to touch on that is because I can speak to this from very recent personal experience. I can speak to both from personal experience, but this is fresher, probably more entertaining. So my wife and I took a trip a few weeks back where, without getting too specific about location, we went on a hike. And when I say a hike, it was more of a Manchurian death march, but regardless. It was something we had been planning to do and had made attempts at in the past and failed because of injury and stuff like that. So this year was the year, and we did manage it. The trip was more or less 70 kilometers from start to finish, and that's just trail miles. It took us 4 days, 3 nights, and short of major calamity, any small thing that could have gone wrong pretty well did. Now, that's not maybe strictly relevant, but I want to just paint a little bit of a picture here and give you some context for what I'm talking about. Now, something else I want to touch on here is you read where Paul says that he buffeted his body, or he inflicted physical pain on himself. And again, there's extremes to this, I understand, but bear with me. So we had planned this trip, and this is a concept that we were already familiar with. So we decided, well, we're doing this anyway. We're not going with anyone. You don't really have opportunity on the trail so much to talk except for the express purpose of just simply making noise to avoid bears, which didn't work, by the way. That's another story. So we decided, in conjunction with our vacation or our trip through some of the most rugged country this side of the Rockies, that we would kind of combine this with the whole meeting God in the wilderness thing. And there is certainly an element of intentionality here. You can't just go walk off into the bush willy-nilly and just expect something to happen. No, you have to set out with an intention, as with so many things. So that's what we did. And in the moment, for those 4 days that were the hardest 4 days of my life, bar none, there was no great, clouds roll back, sunbeam moment where angels sang and you had this great revelation. If I'm being completely honest, and this doesn't sound very spiritual of me at all, but it is what it is, and so take it for what it's worth. For those 4 days, I was completely and utterly miserable. And that, I thought at the time, was interfering with our goal of meeting God in the wilderness. However, when we got done, it took a day or two for all of the initial pain to wear off, but looking back, there were times where you felt alone, 20, 30 kilometers from the nearest road, never mind a town, with two large lakes and numerous granite ridges in the way. Humanly speaking, other than the hateful chipmunks and bears, you are utterly alone. We went 3 days and didn't see another living soul. So, in that sense, you were alone. And there were times where the going was so rough and so hard, you did feel literally abandoned. We had 4 straight days of 9 hours at a time with no break. And we got rained on. We had to wade across beaver dams that had been submerged, none of which was planned for. Planned for as a contingency, but not expected. We ran up against solid granite walls with a rope dangling in the rain without climbing gear. I hope you can hear the tone in my voice here. We weren't very impressed at the time, to put it lightly. But when we got done and looked back, we realized for everything that did go wrong, broken gear, bear in the campsite in the middle of the night, distances and routes that were, frankly, if you had looked at them under any other circumstance, you would have gone, that's impossible, can't be done. But when you're in the moment, and to go back is further than to go forward, the only way out is you walk out or you get helicoptered out, and that wasn't on my list of things to do that week. You push through it. You don't have an option. And this may sound like a trivial thing to those listening, but my revelation had to do with blisters. I know it sounds stupid, but understand, my wife and I, we do rack up a few trail miles every year, and my feet are exceptionally prone to blisters. But on this trip, 4 days, 70 kilometers, soaking wet feet every day, we're talking knee-deep mud for 9 hours a day. I actually thought I was going to get trench foot on day 3, but I didn't. And not only did I not get trench foot, for having soaking wet feet, cuticles turned to pudding just about, I didn't have a single blister in 4 days. And like I said, this may sound anticlimactic to you listening, but literally, that is nothing short of miraculous, because I know how my feet react. And to give you just a little bit of context, the next week, we went on another walk through the exact opposite kind of terrain, gently rolling forested hills, which normally would be a walk in the park, literally. And we did about 6 kilometers, which, compared to what we had just done, was nothing. I was wearing the same shoes, and in 6 kilometers, 2 blisters. And this was a long enough time away that my feet had completely recovered. There was no residual anything on any of my joints or anything like that. So that wasn't the case, or the problem to blame. The plain and simple fact of the matter is, the fact that I didn't have blisters from that trip told me everything I needed to know. Where we thought, or we felt, abandoned, divinely speaking, at points, and where we thought this was just suffering for the sake of masochism, it occurred to me that we weren't alone out there by any means. Because for everything that did go wrong, there were 3 things that didn't go wrong. And for everything that went right, that could have gone wrong, in some cases it didn't make a ton of sense. And that may seem trivial, but speaking to us, this is a kind of a, when you go to meet God in the wilderness, it's always going to be a highly subjective experience, because it's not a congregational thing or a church thing or a small group thing. It's specifically tailored to you for what you need to know, what you need to hear, and what you need to understand. And what this brought out to us is that even when it doesn't feel like you have support, the fact of the matter is that, divinely speaking, you don't walk alone. And in this case, you don't literally walk alone. And like I said, it may sound trivial to you, but it was definitely a reinforcement that both my wife and I needed, which was and is directly applicable to other circumstances going on that are not directly related to, wilderness experience or hiking or backpacking or anything like that. So what's the takeaway here? Well, I'm not going to tell you to go do what we did, because I wouldn't wish that on anybody, frankly. I know that doesn't sound very spiritual or very noble, but like I said, you pretty much get what you pay for around here. So what's the takeaway? Well, you don't have to do things as extremely as we did. This is something we signed up for. We sort of knew what to expect, and that's pretty much what we got. It's maybe a little rougher than we wanted, but so be it. But for you, there's a lesson here, or maybe not a lesson so much as a challenge, where to meet God in the wilderness is to unplug from society. Why did God say, speaking of the Feast of Tabernacles, which is coming up here this week as a matter of fact, why did he say that go into the wilderness and I will meet my people there? Well, the reason is, in this case, and also for the, down to the river to pray kind of thing, is that you remove yourself from your routine, you remove yourself from what is familiar, you remove yourself from people that distract you and relationships that need maintenance. You remove yourself from the daily grind, and you put yourself in a situation where all of those things become irrelevant. Not permanently irrelevant, but in the moment, you have other things to worry about. And you're also put in a situation where, similar to fasting, your flesh is weakened to the point that you have to rely on the Father's provision to make it home alive in some cases. But, it doesn't have to be that extreme. But the other thing is, this is my kind of personal interpretation here. In our highly technological world, if you're listening to this, you obviously have access to the internet. Everywhere you go that has anything to do with civilization, your car, your house, your office, the street, everything is absolutely soaked in radio frequency, microwaves, and all kinds of electronic noise. And that's besides the distraction of the cell phone, the tablet, the computer, the laptop, the Xbox, the PlayStation, the Netflix, the television, the football game, whatever, hockey game, basketball, pick your poison. It's aside from all of that, which is relevant, you're also being bathed in these unnatural frequencies. And when you get away from them, even if you're not a spiritual person, and it's not just the electromagnetic thing, but when you get away from all of it, the distraction, the routine, everything, even if you don't think you're spiritual, you suddenly may be surprised to find out that you're more spiritual than you think. Because when the rest of the noise fades away, and it's just you and the trees and the dirt under your feet, you suddenly, and this may sound hokey, so be it, but you suddenly become aware of your spiritual senses, where you don't have these distractions cluttering your mind, where your mind becomes quiet, and especially when you head off with the intention to meet God in the wilderness, it becomes quiet with intention. And you know what? In cases like that, it wasn't the case for us this time, but there have been times, and there will be other times for myself, as well as you listening, if you try this, where it didn't happen for us this time, but there are those, cloud opening, beam of sun revelation moments. Absolutely, they do happen. So what I would challenge you to do is not go pack a backpack and go for 4 days through what, the military would say is pretty intense. But rather than that, especially, given your fitness and skill level, comfort level, what have you, find a place near you this weekend. The weather should still be fairly okay, barring any rain. We're up here in Canada. It's October, but just today it's over 20 degrees Celsius. Take the bare essentials. Bottle of water, maybe that's it. I won't say leave the phone at home because then I have all kinds of liability issues, but turn the phone off, leave it in your bag, don't pull it out. Find a local place away from town, away from people, and go for a walk. Now, don't take a 5-minute walk and say, okay, well, did my duty. No. Take a long enough walk that the noise of the day and the noise of the week has the opportunity to slip into the background, where you're going out here with an intention to meet with God, right? Even, I believe it was Abraham. Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. Might have the name wrong. Yeah, I probably do. Regardless, he went to Mount Carmel to listen for the still small voice, right? He was in the wilderness. He was in a quiet area without distraction. And ultimately, that's what this is about. Besides the whole, physical mortification of the flesh thing, you're looking to remove yourself from an environment full of distraction. And I would also add, like I said before, you're also removing yourself in our modern world from that electromagnetic pollution and electronic distraction. And when you do that, if you do that, I would challenge you to do that this weekend. Go somewhere, go far enough that all of that has the opportunity to start happening. Might take an hour, might take 2, might take 3. It's not the end of the world. If you're serious about your walk with the Father, a couple of hours is not that much to sacrifice. But I'll be bored. I don't care. That's the point. Anyway, I would challenge you to try it. you don't have anything to lose. And besides the spiritual connection you will find if you stick with it long enough, even in the first time you try it, you'll also be benefiting yourself physically in the long run, especially in our sedentary, office work-driven lives, so many of us. But again, do it smart. There's obviously safety things to consider when you're alone and things like that. So just don't be stupid and don't blame me for anything you do wrong. But I would challenge you this weekend to try it and see what comes of it. Like I said, if you do it long enough, you will have result. There's a reason all the prophets of the Old Testament, or not all of them, but many of them are described as, living away from town. It's because it's easier to hear things when you don't have a pile of noise in your ears all the time. So, this episode was a little bit more anecdotal than anything else, but you know what? Sometimes anecdotes are what you need to hear. And sometimes these experiences, because they are so subjective, can only be properly relayed with anecdotes. So I hope what you've heard here is useful. And again, I would challenge you to give this a try. You have nothing to do but win when you try it. And with that, I would remind you, have a look at the article linked in the description box below. There's more there that we didn't cover. There's stuff in this episode that won't be in the article as well. So give it a try, check it out. And with that, I will leave you for now, and blessings.